Welcome to this series of companion videos to the book Buddhism in 10 Steps. My name is Peto. I'm the co-author of the book, along with Buddhist monk Sanathavihari Bhikkhu. Buddhism in 10 Steps is designed for that beginner or Westerner who's exploring Buddhism and needs a quick and easy introduction to the religion. So these video series will introduce you to those 10 different steps that we've introduced inside the book, along with some other information. So we hope you enjoy this and find it a nice companion to the book. What is Buddhism? Buddhism is a worldwide religion that can be summed up like this. It is the liberating path towards freedom. This is the freedom from what we call dukkha in Buddhism, which is unsatisfactoriness, sometimes translated as suffering. This suffering, this unsatisfactoriness, this dukkha, is a result of our intentional volitional actions, which we call karma. Karma is important in Buddhism because it is what keeps us trapped in something called the cycle of rebirth, or samsara in Buddhism. Because we are trapped in this cycle of rebirth, samsara, due to our intentional volitional actions, karma, we experience dukkha, this suffering, this unsatisfactoriness, from this forced rebirth inside this cycle. The Buddha said that we can stop that cycle. We can experience this peace, this perfect existence, this mental state, which he called nirvana. But we do that by following his teachings, the Dharma. So why are we creating these conditions in our life? Why are we creating this karma? It's due to something called the three fires or three poisons. And I realize that's a lot of terminology I'm throwing out at you right now, but this three fires, three poisons is really important. It is ignorance of the Buddha's teachings, the Dharma, which tells us the true reality of our world and our existence. Because we don't understand that, we are sort of in this illusionary world based upon our perceptions. And because of that, we are constantly seeking out pleasurable things. We are greedy, we are attached to those things, but they are impermanent, they are ever changing, but we don't fundamentally understand that. So when they are taken away from us, we have this hatred, this anger, this aversion due to that. So this three fires, three poisons, we are constantly fueling it, whether it is similar to ingesting poison or being burned by the three fires. They are not your true state. That's not how you should actually live. So the removal of these three fires, three poisons, whichever terminology you like to use, is nirvana. Nirvana in Buddhism is the extinguishing of those three fires. It's removing the ignorance of the Buddha's teachings. It is no longer clinging, craving towards pleasurable things that are just giving rise in our mind, that are impermanent, unchanging, ever changing, but we don't believe that. So when we lose that, we get this anger, hatred, aversion, which all happens very seamlessly and makes us create karma, those intentional volitional actions. And that is important because the three fires, three poisons, which we're fueling, which is helping us create these karmic actions, is keeping us trapped in a cycle of rebirth. The Buddha said this cycle of rebirth itself is not necessarily suffering or unsatisfactoriness. It's a forced rebecoming. It's in these new existences, not the same as reincarnation. We call it rebirth in Buddhism because there's nothing permanent or unchanging that continues on. It's only your karmic actions. So this constant rebecoming, this constant rebecoming of the karma in new existences, temporary conditioned states, is unsatisfactory. And when we fundamentally understand that the way the Buddha taught, and we are able to extinguish the three fires, we are no longer creating the karma that creates the conditions of forced rebirth. And thus, we are able to reside in this pure, natural, true state of nirvana. So a Buddhist goal is to achieve enlightenment, sometimes called awakening, to the truth of the Buddha's teachings, so that they see the three fires, three poisons for what they really are and how it's creating karma, so we can extinguish that, we can stop that, and live as we truly should in our state of nirvana. Who and what is the Buddha? So Buddha is a name and a term for an enlightened being that teaches others. There's only one Buddha of an era that reveals this hidden truth to teachings that have been lost. So in our current era, our Buddha is known as either Shakyamuni Buddha or Gautama Buddha, who was born 2,600 years ago and was the Buddha at that time. So there are Buddhas before Shakyamuni and there'll be Buddhas after Shakyamuni. And they will come when the teachings are lost to rediscover them and teach other people. So these liberating teachings are known as the Dharma, or something they refer to as the Buddha Dharma. Now, a Buddha does start off as a human, but they are no longer considered a regular person or a human when they become a Buddha, and that's by the Buddha's own words. So when we look at our current Buddha of our era, he started off as Siddhartha Gautama. He was born into this life of luxury and pleasure where his father didn't want him to really see the true realities of our world because he was afraid he would become an ascetic, he would become like a monk instead of being a ruler like him. And it wasn't until Siddhartha was able to really see the true nature of reality and the world and existence that he set out to become a monk. And he tried under many, many different teachers, never really discovering the truth that he was looking for, although he was very exceptional in all these different teachings that he learned from. So he set out on his own, almost died, and was able to realize it's not going to extremes on this path towards the truth, which is now what we refer to as the middle way or middle path, and was able to meditate until he discovered the truth. So it was a long process for him, but this is where he became the Buddha. He even challenged this deity, this demon, if you will, known as Mara, who tried everything to prevent him from becoming the Buddha who would be teaching others. Yet Siddhartha prevailed and became Shakyamuni or Gautama Buddha. And so he set forth for a career that spanned 40 years of teaching others. And you'll learn about those teachings in this video series and this book. But he did a remarkable thing because he was able to rediscover the truth that has been known to prior Buddhas and was able to teach others and help them become enlightened as well. This is why the Buddha is so revered and respected, and we have faith in the Buddha's teachings because he has shown us that yes, it can be done. He has shown us that he has helped others become enlightened as well, and we can also do the same. So what did the Buddha teach? Well, we refer to his teachings now as the Dharma or the Buddha Dharma, which is the truth or liberating teachings. And if we step back and look really at what the Buddha believed and taught, he did mention something to us called the 3 marks of existence. That is, all things are marked with impermanence, suffering, and the illusion of self. And really he was giving us teachings so we would understand our current conditions and how to change that. So impermanence means that nothing is permanent and unchanging, although we believe it does, and is also part of what we call dependent origination in Buddhism, where everything is dependent upon other things to arise and cease. So these concepts are really important because what the Buddha became awakened and enlightened to was the truth of dependent origination and impermanence. When he, not intellectually, but fundamentally understood that, he saw the true nature of our world. He saw everything as we're currently existing in it is not the real reality, not the true existence we should be in. Because we have this suffering, which is known as dukkha in Buddhism, sometimes referred to as unsatisfactoriness or something not quite right. That's due to us fueling the 3 fires of ignorance, greed, and anger, which creates karmic actions, which are intentional, volitional actions, typically unwholesome. Because we're creating those actions, we are continuing this cycle of rebirth, constant rebecoming, which is unsatisfactory. Anything that is conditioned is going to be unsatisfactory. It's going to be suffering. And you may not think about that right now, but yes, that is unsatisfactory because nothing lasting there. So even if you're blissfully happy in one moment doesn't mean you'll be blissfully happy in the next moment, or even long term, because we will all eventually cease in this form. And that also gives to the 3rd mark of existence, which is the illusion of self. So we sometimes call this not self or non-self in Buddhism. It's not saying that you don't exist or I don't exist right now or have these thoughts, but what it's saying is we don't have what we believe we have, even if it's at some small little morsel or degree, that we believe there's something permanent, unchanging, and independent about our nature, about ourself. The Buddha said that is the illusion. So when we are able to fundamentally understand that we don't have a permanent, unchanging, independent self, that allows us to stop fueling the three fires of greed, anger, and ignorance. And thus we are able to become awakened, enlightened to that truth, and then reside in our true natural state of nirvana. Nirvana is absent of the three fires, which give rise to karma, which give rise to this constant forced rebirth in the cycle of birth and death, samsara, not the same as reincarnation. And thus we are able to exist and live as we truly have without just randomly and unskillfully reacting and consuming things that are giving rise in our minds, which make us create that karma. So in summary, the Buddha was teaching us this liberating path towards our true self, not the self that's conditioned right now. So this conditioned self is believing all these things, is consuming all these things, is arising all these things, which is making us create actions which are not skillful, not wholesome, even if we don't realize that, which is keeping us trapped like prisoners. It's called fetters in Buddhism. It's chaining us to this cycle of birth and death, unsatisfactory. The Buddha is allowing us to break those chains, make us free, and be who we really are, residing in our true state of nirvana. And that is what he was trying to do and has accomplished with Buddhism. As we have seen throughout his life, he was able to help others become enlightened and realize nirvana or nibbana, and that is his true legacy, which continues 2,600 years ago to today. One of the Buddha's most famous teachings is called the Four Noble Truths. It's really a summary of Buddhism, which explains our conditions and how to get out of it. So the very first teaching, the Four Noble Truths, he let people know the effect and then the cause, and then the effect and then the cause. So it's very different than we might assume otherwise, but it's very similar to how like a physician, a medical physician, may tell somebody about a disease and eventually the cure. So his first step is actually letting the patient, us, understand why we are sick, because we don't actually understand we are sick in the Buddhist religious sense, not the medical or physical sense, that we are sick with dukkha, this suffering, this unsatisfactoriness. And so he's telling us in the first noble truth, we are essentially sick with dukkha. We are marked with this. We are creating these conditions where it's just not satisfactory, it's suffering. But why am I sick? Buddha, right? And so he has to tell us the cause. And the cause is our karmic actions, the actions we are creating that's trapping us in this cycle of rebirth, constant rebecoming. So every new existence has these karma that we're creating now, will go on to a future one, and we are the recipients of the prior ones. So he's saying this temporary, ever-changing, conditioned existence is unsatisfactory, is suffering, because we don't know really how to deal with that, right? And we're trapped in a cycle of rebirth. So because of that, we are creating karmic actions based upon the three fires of ignorance, greed, and anger. That is our problem. It's almost like if you were ingesting poison or if you were burned, right? Well, shouldn't you realize that you've been ingesting poison or were burned? Well, the Buddha is saying that you may not always realize that because we're so conditioned to maybe sipping that poison of the three poisons or getting burned or smoke inhalation from the three fires, whichever terminology you want to use, where we don't really realize that. Sometimes we do. Sometimes it's very much in our face, but most of the time it's very subtle. But we are creating karmic actions based upon that. So then he goes into what is your prognosis, basically. What's the third noble truth? Can I stop this sickness of dukkha? And he says, absolutely. Everyone can stop this suffering, this dukkha. And you may go, that's fantastic. Well, how do I stop this dukkha? Because you've told me I'm sick with dukkha. this suffering, this unsatisfactoriness. And you're saying it's due to my actions, my karma, based upon the three fires, three poisons of ignorance, greed, and anger. But you told me that I can stop that. I don't have to become sick with dukkha anymore. How do I do that? That's the fourth noble truth. If you follow his prescription, which is going to be the Noble Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is the liberating path towards freedom of Nirvana in Buddhism. And that path, that Nirvana, is where you stop the three fires from having fuel, or the three poisons from you drinking it, essentially. And that is what he taught us. So he's going to tell us that we are experiencing dukkha in this existence due to our karmic actions based upon our ignorance of the truth and our seeking pleasurable things, and losing those, we get angry, we get hatred. It's this constant cycle that's keeping us trapped in rebirth. But we can stop rebirth, we can stop this samsaric cycle, we can be free from that suffering, that dukkha, and we do that through his prognosis, his steps, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. The Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path is the liberating path that leads us to enlightenment and nirvana, or nibbana. And that is our goal as Buddhists. Now, the Eightfold Path is grouped into three categories, or three groupings, or three sections. And that's the most important part, because yes, you have these 8 steps, if you will, inside the Noble Eightfold Path. They are meant to be practiced all together. And ultimately, when you fully practice all 8 parts of the Eightfold Path, that is where you become enlightened, awakened, and realize nirvana or nibbana. And the 3 parts there are what we refer to as the threefold training. And the threefold training is practiced by basically all the Buddhist traditions, but it may not always be referred to as that, or even the Eightfold Path itself may not even be always referred to. But this is what we're using as Buddhists to ensure we have a proper Buddhist practice. It is a grouping or a category, the first one, of morality or conduct, which is very important. When we are able to do that, even the Buddha said this is one of the most important parts of the Eightfold Path, that we are able to live our lives without harming others and in right symbiotic relationship with others. We are doing it where our morality and our conduct is aligned to how a Buddha or a Bodhisattva or an Arhat should be. Then we see the wisdom category. So it's not being book smart, it's not being intellectual, but it's about having that fundamental understanding. But we may start from that level. We're going to have this understanding of the Buddhist teachings and concepts that are going to help us as we get towards awakening and enlightenment, help us make those connections for ourselves, help us understand and break this illusionary idea we have about our world and life. And then we have concentration, sometimes referred to as meditative concentration, grouping, or category. It's everything from like having the right effort and determination, and yes, the right meditative concentration. All that's important for really taking it to that final step, that final level. But we are practicing all of these together holistically when we can. The truth that the Buddha was awakened or enlightened to was the truth of dependent origination, or the law of dependent origination. And this is important because you, me, everything around us is due to dependent origination. And this is sometimes referred to as cause and effect, or the law of cause and effect. But as simple and high level as that terminology is, it really doesn't give justice to this teaching we have called dependent origination. As simple in some ways as this teaching is, it is so challenging to fundamentally understand. We see people like the Buddha, that when he was Siddhartha Gautama, it took him a long period of time and effort to ultimately understand at a fundamental level. So it's okay if we don't fundamentally understand it right away. But dependent origination is interconnected with all the other different Buddhist teachings and concepts. Karma, rebirth, everything else is really related to that. So for anything to exist, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It must have the right causes and conditions to come together. For example, as a human being, I am a grouping of 5 things, 5 skandhas or 5 aggregates. But that's a temporary, and it is a ever-changing grouping of things, but eventually it will no longer have the right conditions to continue on. And that's important. So this is just a temporary existence of mine. The karma I'm creating, that's what continues on. Now, why is this important? Well, this idea that we have of a permanent, unchanging, independent self is due to our ignorance of the truth, but is due to some very clever and seamless process that our body and our existence is going through. You'll hear this term called nama-rupa. So basically, it's going to be name and form. And as we are looking at things, and it's giving rise in our minds, and we're giving our perceptions to that and our ideas about it, this is all happening so seamlessly that, yes, I can see this room and this world that I'm in, I can see you, I can see me, but it's all our perceptions and our assumptions about it. It's not the true reality. But you may go, well, I can feel, the door, or I can feel the car, or myself. I can touch myself, and I can see that I have flesh and bones, and I can see this, right? But it's our perceptions and our assumptions about it that are giving rise, and our mind, our body, doesn't want us to really break free, experience nirvana, as we were talking about. So it is giving rise to different thoughts and ideas, which are not really true reality, but we believe they're true reality. And it's very hard to understand as that is. What the Buddha is talking about with dependent origination is all things are conditioned. All things are impermanent and ever-changing and interdependent upon other things, and they will cease when those conditions no longer give rise to them. But it doesn't mean they go away into nothing. These different things will give rise to something else in the future, but they don't have a permanent essence to them, which is unchanging and impermanent and independent of other things. He didn't say that. So this is a really important concept. It can be a lot to understand. It's why Buddhists practice as well, to fundamentally understand that as best they can. You have likely heard of the word karma. It's used so much in our world, but what is it in the Buddhist context? Karma is actually something that Buddhists don't want to generate, and that might be very shocking to you because you might have heard of terms like good karma and bad karma, and we don't use that terminology in Buddhism. There's wholesome and unwholesome karma, and also neutral karma. Now, when karma is used in a Buddhist context, we're talking about the intentional volitional actions. These are things that we are doing based upon typically the three fires, three poisons of ignorance, greed, and anger. So thus, there's something we don't want to have happen because they trap us in this cycle of forced rebirth, which is, as the Buddha said, dukkha, unsatisfactory, suffering. So we create these actions through our mind, our thoughts, our speech, our actions. So we got three major ways that we create karma, but we are doing this all the time, our mind, speech, actions, right? We're doing this all the time, but they're usually not in accord and align with the Buddhist teachings towards the path towards liberation. That's the wholesome karma we want. So yes, even wholesome karma keeps us trapped in a cycle of rebirth, but it's creating the right conditions so that we will eventually be an enlightened and awakened being like a Buddha, Bodhisattva, Arhat, which are able to create neutral karma. They're not creating karma that forces them to stick inside rebirth. So karma, it is something we ultimately don't want, but one thing we want to do right now as lay practitioners is create wholesome karma that's aligned with the Buddhist path, is not trapping us in a way that's permanent because it's leading us towards liberation. What is not self or non-self in Buddhism? So the Buddha said that we are conditioned beings. That's that teaching of dependent origination, that we are impermanent, we are ever-changing, and we are interdependent upon other things. But we don't believe that. We believe we are unchanging, we are permanent, or something about it is permanent, and we're not dependent upon other things to exist. But it's not true. So not self or non-self is not saying that you or me don't exist or other conditioned phenomena don't exist. They absolutely do. But we believe there's just something about them that has a permanent, unchanging, independent characteristic. And for all of us, that's true. Whether you have this intellectual, like, well, I know we're going to die and all this other stuff. There's something inside you, maybe it's the ego or self or an idea or belief. That is what we're clinging or craving onto. When we are able to transcend that by fundamentally understanding dependent origination, other Buddhist teachings, that's where we're able to break this idea of self in Buddhism. And the self we're talking about is the belief in a permanent, unchanging, independent self, which the Buddha says does not exist. Because we are constantly interacting with sense objects and through our sense organs, like our eyes, I can see things, and nose, I can smell things. And this is giving rise to things in our mind. And I talked about previously about nama rupa, name and form. And so we're constantly have this seamless process inside us where it's giving rise to this world that we believe we're living in insofar as our perceptions and our assumptions about it. And that is giving rise to this belief in a self. And because we have this belief in a permanent, unchanging, independent self, we want to cling to that. We want to crave to that. That gives fuel to the three fires: ignorance, greed, anger, which creates, you guessed it, karma. And karma keeps us trapped in rebirth. So the teaching and concept of not self in Buddhism is important because we want to get to that level where we are no longer clinging, craving, loving the idea of a permanent, unchanging, independent self. That's what we're trying to get rid of, not the idea that we don't exist or do exist. Not that. We're talking about that particular idea. What is rebirth in Buddhism? It's actually very important because it's the reason why Buddhists actually practice. Buddhists don't practice just to become enlightened, to gain some type of awakened state. It's actually so they are no longer trapped in the cycle of rebirth, samsara. And rebirth is not the same as reincarnation. Reincarnation is where there's some type of essence or piece of it that is permanent. It is unchanging and it's independent of other things which continue on to a new existence. The Buddha flatly rejected that. He says, we are ever changing, we are impermanent, and we are dependent upon other things to exist and to not exist. And so that's a key characteristics of Buddhism. But what is being reborn? And then if we don't have reincarnation, we have rebirth, what's going on? Well, in what we call samsara, the cycle of birth and death inside Buddhism, we are a temporary, ever-changing, interdependent existence right now. And it's called 5 aggregates, 5 skandhas, and it works so seamlessly together with that nama rupa I was talking about earlier, where we believe in this idea of self. And that gives rise to us creating karmic actions. And so that karmic actions, those karma, you can think of them like seeds being planted into your consciousness. So there's something called the stream of consciousness inside Buddhism. Of all the 5 aggregates, 5 skandhas, we do have the mind, the consciousness, but there's one layer there, the stream consciousness. That's what connects all the prior existences to all the future existences. And it's not the same as the soul or self. What continues on are karma. So the results of karma and future potential of karma hasn't come to fruition yet are all there. Right now, you, me, we are all the recipients of past karma from that stream of consciousness, good or bad, wholesome or unwholesome. So that's why we try to create wholesome karma for the next existence, which is not going to be the same as me, but it's going to have the karma that I'm continuing forward with, which I've received and hasn't come to fruition, and the ones that I'm creating that haven't come to fruition. But also will contain your vows. So vows could be, for example, in Mahayana, maybe a bodhisattva vow to become a Buddha in the future. So those can continue as well. But the important part is the karma continues on, not some permanent, unchanging, independent self inside Buddhism. What is Nirvana? Also called Nibbana. This is, in the most basic term, putting out, extinguishing. Extinguishing what? The 3 fires of ignorance, greed, and anger, as I've said many times, is what causes those karmic actions, typically unwholesome karmic actions, in our life. So we don't want karma because it traps us to rebirth. So Nibbana or Nirvana is where we extinguish the 3 fires of greed, anger, and ignorance, which is not our true natural state. Just like if there was a fire burning you right now, or smoke inhalation, or if we use the term the 3 poisons, like if you were ingesting poison, either a lot or small, none of that, the fire or poison analogies for these terms, is going to be your true existence. That's not how you should live. So when we put them out through awakening and enlightenment, that is where we reside in our true natural state of nirvana. That is without that. and without us creating those karmic actions anymore. True liberation. Now, we may still have remainders of those three fires where it's still warm, still cooling down. We can still be burned by that, but we are no longer fueling it. We're no longer creating it. That's keeping us trapped.